April 11, 1945. Late afternoon. On the western bank of the Elbe River, Lieutenant General William Simpson stood with binoculars raised, looking east. The view was unobstructed. A wide German highway ran straight toward Berlin. No visible armor. No organized defenses. No traffic moving west. The war, as a military problem, was finished in front of him. Simpson commanded the Ninth Army. 300,000 men. Fully supplied. Mechanized. Disciplined. His forward units had crossed the river at multiple points. German soldiers were surrendering in groups, so large they clogged the roads. Officers removed insignia. Weapons were stacked in piles. They were asking for Americans by name. Anything but capture by the Red Army. Simpson lowered the binoculars and made a decision that, under normal circumstances, required no debate. He reached for the field telephone and called General Omar Bradley at 12th Army Group headquarters. His request was direct. Permission to advance. He stated the distance. 50 miles. He stated the condition of the enemy. Disintegrated. He stated the timeline. Berlin within 24 hours. There was a pause. Bradley did not answer immediately. The line remained open while Bradley consulted Supreme Headquarters. When Bradley returned, his voice was controlled and final. The answer was no. The order was explicit. The Ninth Army would halt at the Elbe. No movement east. No probing attacks. No reconnaissance toward Berlin. The advance was over. Simpson repeated the order back to confirm it. Halt at the river. Hold position. Await further instructions. He replaced the receiver without comment. Around him, his army continued its routine. Engineers improved bridges. Infantry dug shallow positions they would never use. Tanks sat idling, pointed toward a capital they would not enter. At that moment, the decision was complete. Berlin was no longer an American objective. Not because it was unreachable, not because it was defended, but because, somewhere above Simpson's authority, it had been judged unnecessary. By the second week of April 1945, the Western Front had ceased to function as a front in any meaningful military sense. What remained of the German army was no longer an integrated force, but a collection of collapsing fragments moving east out of instinct rather than command. The American armies were not advancing cautiously. They were accelerating. After the Rhine crossings in late March, resistance evaporated at a speed no planner had predicted. Towns fell without engagement. Corps boundaries blurred because units were moving faster than headquarters could redraw maps. Supply officers stopped calculating consumption rates and simply tried to keep fuel flowing in the general direction of the advance. The Ninth Army's drive east was the most methodical example of this collapse. In 3 weeks, Simpson's formations covered more than 200 miles. They bypassed cities that would once have required siege. They left entire German units behind them, disarmed by fear rather than force. Luftwaffe interference had vanished. Artillery opposition was sporadic and uncoordinated. Roads, rail lines, and bridges lay intact not because they were defended, but because no one remained capable of defending them. Militarily, Berlin was not a fortress in April 1945. It was a destination. Its outer defenses existed on paper and in propaganda broadcasts, not in deployable combat power. The divisions nominally assigned to its defense had either been destroyed on the Eastern Front or stripped to cadres and fed piecemeal into delaying actions elsewhere. What forces remained were Volkssturm units, convalescents, police battalions, and remnants ordered to hold ground for symbolic reasons. The decisive factor was not strength, but preference. German soldiers were no longer choosing where to fight. They were choosing who to surrender to. Along the Elbe, this preference was unmistakable. Entire companies marched west under white flags. Officers presented sidearms personally. Men crossed minefields they had laid themselves to reach American lines before Soviet artillery could range them. From a purely operational standpoint, Simpson's assessment was correct. A rapid armored thrust to Berlin would not have required a pitched battle. It would have required speed, fuel, and permission. The Ninth Army possessed all three. Its flanks were secure. To the north, British forces were advancing in parallel. To the south, Patton's Third Army had already penetrated deeper into Germany than any Allied formation in history. No German reserve existed capable of cutting the American spearhead. None existed capable of counterattack. Urban combat was unavoidable once inside the capital, but even there, the conditions favored the attacker. Berlin's garrison expected annihilation by the Red Army and showed little inclination to die resisting Americans. Intelligence officers on the ground reported repeated cases of German units abandoning prepared positions once they realized Soviet forces were not the ones approaching. Time mattered. Every day of delay narrowed the gap between the two Allied advances. Soviet armies were paying for their progress with massed infantry assaults and staggering casualties, but they were advancing nonetheless. The race was not theoretical. It was measured in hours. From the standpoint of military logic alone, Berlin was not only attainable. It was the most efficient way to terminate organized resistance in the West. Taking the capital would collapse what little centralized authority remained. It would formalize surrender in fact, not merely in broadcast declarations. Nothing on the battlefield prevented this outcome. No German formation blocked it. No terrain denied it. No logistical constraint delayed it. The opportunity existed because the enemy had already lost. The warning did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It came as a steady accumulation of reports, summaries, and assessments flowing upward into Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. By early April, Eisenhower was no longer reading about German divisions collapsing in front of American armies. He was reading about German forces allegedly regrouping elsewhere. The focus of those reports was not Berlin. It was the South. Intelligence officers at SHEF were tracking what they believed to be a deliberate withdrawal of elite German units away from the collapsing front and toward the mountains of Bavaria and western Austria. Signals intercepts suggested SS formations moving off established axes of retreat. Aerial reconnaissance showed increased traffic into Alpine valleys. Human intelligence, drawn from resistance networks and interrogations, repeated the same theme with growing urgency. The conclusion presented to Eisenhower was coherent and internally consistent. Germany was abandoning the symbolic defense of its capital in favor of a survivable one. The regime's leadership, it was argued, no longer expected to win a conventional war. Instead, it was preparing to continue it. The concept had a name: the National Redoubt. According to the intelligence picture assembled in late March and early April, the Alpine region was being transformed into a fortress. Underground factories carved into mountainsides. Stockpiles of food and ammunition sufficient for years. Fortified passes capable of denying access to mechanized forces. Most critically, it was believed that the most ideologically committed units of the SS were being funneled into this redoubt to serve as the core of a prolonged resistance. The numbers attached to these assessments were not trivial. Estimates ranged from 200,000 to 300,000 troops. Not demoralized conscripts, but veterans. Units expected to fight without regard for survival. Men who would not surrender because surrender had already been defined as betrayal. Eisenhower did not dismiss these reports lightly. He had spent the previous year watching German forces fight, delaying actions far beyond rational expectation. In Italy, relatively small numbers of defenders had held entire Allied armies at bay for months by exploiting terrain. In the Ardennes, a defeated enemy had still managed to assemble enough combat power to inflict the largest single American battle of the war. The idea that Germany would attempt to trade space for time was not irrational. It aligned with Nazi propaganda. It aligned with Hitler's past behavior. It aligned with the regime's obsession with symbolic last stands. Eisenhower's concern was not political prestige. It was duration. A war that ended in Berlin was a war that ended quickly. A war that continued in the Alps could stretch into another year. Mountain warfare would neutralize Allied armor, limit air support, and favor defenders willing to absorb losses. Casualties would rise sharply. Public tolerance would fall just as sharply. Within SHAF, the assessment hardened into a planning assumption. Berlin became a terminal point rather than a decisive one. The decisive threat, as presented, was mobile and unfinished. If Allied armies rushed east and allowed the redoubt to solidify, they would face a second campaign under worse conditions against a more fanatical enemy. This was not paranoia in isolation. The intelligence community reinforced itself. Each report confirmed the last. Disconfirming evidence was scarce, not because it did not exist, but because it was not prioritized. Units surrendering in the north did not negate reports of preparation in the south. Empty highways to Berlin did not contradict alleged construction in the mountains. Eisenhower's credibility as a commander rested on avoiding unnecessary slaughter. He had been chosen not for tactical brilliance, but for judgment under coalition pressure. Ending the war mattered. Ending it cleanly mattered more. By the time the warning reached its final form, it no longer read like speculation. It read like a deadline. Act now, or face a fortified enemy beyond reach. In that framework, the choice narrowed. Berlin could wait. The Alps could not. The warning did not claim certainty. It claimed risk. And Eisenhower, weighing the cost of being wrong, prepared to act as if the threat were real. The overrule did not arrive as a debate. It arrived as a clarification of authority. By April 12, 1945, Eisenhower had absorbed the intelligence estimates, reviewed the operational maps, and weighed the competing priorities. What followed was not hesitation, but alignment. Once his judgment settled, the machinery of coalition command moved quickly and decisively. The problem Eisenhower faced was not a lack of capable subordinates. It was too many of them, operating under different national expectations. British commanders expected symbolic victories. American field generals expected freedom of maneuver. Soviet allies expected boundaries to be respected, at least on paper. Every decision at Supreme Headquarters carried consequences far beyond the next battlefield. Berlin was already politically compromised. Agreements made earlier in the war had acknowledged Soviet primacy in the eastern capital. Eisenhower knew this. He also knew that racing the Red Army into a city assigned to another ally risked post-war confrontation before the war had even formally ended. The intelligence reports offered a way around that dilemma. They reframed the question from prestige to prevention. Within SHAF, the logic was presented cleanly. If Allied forces focused on Berlin, they would take a city that was already collapsing while allowing the enemy's alleged last redoubt to solidify. If they turned south, they could eliminate the only remaining threat capable of prolonging the war. The choice was framed as strategic responsibility versus symbolic gain. Institutional caution reinforced the conclusion. Eisenhower's command existed to coordinate allies, not embarrass them. Stalin had made it clear that Berlin mattered to him. Churchill had made it clear that British influence in the endgame was already diminishing. Eisenhower's own political leadership expected a rapid conclusion without unnecessary American losses. The intelligence reports aligned with every one of those pressures. Bradley understood immediately what the decision meant. He did not argue the military feasibility of Berlin. He did not contest Simpson's assessment. He transmitted the order as it was given. Halt at the Elbe. Consolidate. Await further instructions. The wording left no room for initiative. To the south, the consequences were more disruptive. Patton's Third Army had been operating at the edge of what coalition discipline tolerated. His advance had been aggressive, improvised, and frequently ahead of authorization. He had crossed rivers before permission arrived. He had diverted supplies without clearance. He had been indulged because results justified the inconvenience. The new orders ended that latitude. Patton was instructed to abandon his eastern axis and pivot south into Bavaria and Austria. His mission was explicit: destroy the national redoubt, secure the Alpine approaches, prevent the enemy from regrouping in the mountains. The phrasing left no ambiguity about priorities. Berlin was no longer his concern. Patton reacted as expected. He protested to Bradley. He argued that capitals decide wars. He warned that delaying would concede influence to the Soviets permanently. He was not speaking emotionally. He was speaking operationally. Whoever held Berlin would shape the peace. Bradley listened. He agreed privately. He did nothing publicly. Eisenhower did not engage Patton directly. He did not need to. The chain of command functioned as designed. Orders moved downward. Compliance moved upward. Dissent was noted and set aside. The institutional forces behind the decision were stronger than any individual general. Coalition management required predictability. Political leadership required casualty minimization. Intelligence assessments demanded preemption. Together, they formed a consensus that overruled battlefield opportunity. Simpson's army remained stationary not because of logistical exhaustion, but because movement east had been reclassified as unnecessary risk. Patton's army turned south not because the Alps demanded immediate action, but because the possibility that they might someday demand it was deemed unacceptable. The decision insulated Eisenhower from blame on two fronts. If Berlin fell to the Soviets, it could be explained as adherence to agreements. If the war continued in the Alps, it could be explained as unavoidable. The only unacceptable outcome was being caught unprepared. In that calculus, certainty mattered less than control. Berlin represented closure. The Alps represented uncertainty. Eisenhower chose to confront the unknown rather than claim the visible. The overrule was complete when movement ceased. Engines cooled. Maps were redrawn. Objectives were renamed. From that moment forward, the war's final geography was no longer being shaped by battlefield momentum, but by fear of what might still be hiding beyond it. The consequences unfolded immediately, not as a single event, but as a widening contrast that could be seen, heard, and measured across a river that was no longer contested. Along the western bank of the Elbe, American forces settled into enforced inactivity. Tents went up where armored columns had expected to pause only briefly. Vehicles were serviced not for advance, but for waiting. Infantrymen cleaned weapons that would not be fired again in anger. Coffee was brewed. Letters were written. Patrols were limited to maintaining the line, not crossing it. Across the water, the war reached its most violent concentration. From the American side, the sound carried first. A low, continuous thunder from the east. Soviet artillery opening the final assault on Berlin did not announce itself with bursts or crescendos. It rolled, uninterrupted, hour after hour. The sky over the horizon flickered at night, not with tracer fire, but with entire districts burning simultaneously. Refugees began arriving almost immediately. They did not move in organized columns. They came in fragments. Families carrying what they could hold. Elderly men without shoes. Women with children wrapped in blankets that were already filthy from the roads. They crossed the Elbe in boats, on makeshift rafts, and by swimming when nothing else remained. They did not ask for protection. They begged not to be sent back. Their accounts followed a pattern. Soviet units advancing without pause. Cities taken by force, not negotiation. Discipline enforced by terror rather than command. Looting treated as entitlement. Rape treated as reprisal. The details varied. The direction did not. Everyone was moving west. American officers listened, recorded statements, and forwarded summaries up the chain. Nothing changed. The orders remained in force. The boundary was fixed. No one crossed it. Inside Berlin, the German defense did not resemble a strategy. It resembled a sentence being carried out. Units fought because retreat was impossible and surrender meant capture by an enemy that had already defined mercy as weakness. Civilians hid in basements while entire blocks were erased above them. Command structures dissolved. Orders contradicted each other or arrived too late to matter. The Red Army advanced by weight. Infantry followed artillery barges measured not in minutes, but in hours. Losses were accepted as unavoidable. Speed mattered more than preservation. The objective was possession, not efficiency. By the time Soviet forces reached the city center, the casualty figures had already reached levels that would have halted any Western operation. Tens of thousands of soldiers killed in weeks. Entire formations reduced to fractions. None of it altered the pace. From the American side of the Elbe, the city fell by sound before it fell by report. The Ninth Army received confirmation days later. Berlin had been taken. The Reich government had collapsed. The war in Europe was functionally over. At the same time, Patton's Third Army was executing its redirected mission. The movement south did not meet resistance worthy of the name. Roads into Bavaria and Austria were crowded not with SS formations, but with surrendering units moving without coordination. Mountain passes expected to be defended were open. Villages thought to be staging areas were quiet. Intelligence targets dissolved upon contact. Patton's staff prepared for mountain warfare that never materialized. Units trained for climbing operations instead processed prisoners. Engineers prepared for demolitions instead cleared roads. The feared transformation of the Alps into a fortress did not reveal itself gradually. It failed to appear at all. The deeper the Third Army pushed into the mountains, the clearer the absence became. There were no underground factories humming with production, no stockpiles guarded by fanatical formations, no organized command structure directing resistance from hidden headquarters. The terrain was real. The enemy preparation was not. At Berchtesgaden, the symbolic heart of the supposed redoubt, American troops found buildings designed for ceremony and retreat, not defense. The complex was intact because no one had thought to fight from it. It had never been intended as a final stronghold. It had been intended as an image. German soldiers in the region surrendered without negotiation. Officers admitted they had been waiting for Americans specifically. Some had heard of the redoubt only through propaganda broadcasts. Others had assumed it was already abandoned. None behaved as men defending the last refuge of a doomed regime. The consequence of the earlier decision now became measurable in absence rather than blood. There was no second campaign, no prolonged mountain war, no guerrilla resistance stretching the conflict into another year. The threat that had redirected entire armies evaporated on contact with reality. Meanwhile, the political boundary that had been improvised at the Elbe solidified. What had begun as a temporary halt line hardened into a demarcation. Liaison officers coordinated with Soviet counterparts not to plan operations, but to prevent misunderstandings. Flags were raised. Photographs were taken. Friendly gestures masked the fact that movement had stopped permanently. German territory east of the river passed entirely into Soviet control by default rather than contest. American influence ended not at the point of resistance, but at the point of decision. The cost of that decision was not paid in American casualties. It was paid in geography. Berlin became a Soviet city by fact before it became one by agreement. Central Europe aligned accordingly. Administrations were formed under the authority of whoever stood inside the buildings when the shooting stopped. The absence of Western forces was not debated. It was observed. The people who crossed the Elbe understood this before any communique made it official. They did not speak in terms of ideology or post-war settlements. They spoke in terms of who arrived first and who arrived last. By early May, the war in Europe was declared over. Celebrations followed. Orders shifted from combat to occupation. Units that had waited at the river now prepared to turn around. Nothing on the battlefield indicated that the halt had shortened the war. Nothing suggested it had prevented a second phase of fighting. The feared resistance had not been delayed. It had never been there. What had occurred instead was a transfer completed without contest. The Ninth Army never entered Berlin. It watched the end of the war from a distance measured not in miles, but in decisions already made. By the time the guns fell silent, the consequences were no longer reversible. The opportunity had passed. The boundary remained. The battlefield had obeyed the order. History absorbed the result. The post-war record stripped the decision of its urgency and left it exposed to comparison. In the months and years that followed Germany's surrender, the intelligence picture that had driven Eisenhower's choice was re-examined in fragments rather than as a single failure. Files were reviewed. Interrogations were translated. Captured documents were cataloged and cross-referenced. What emerged was not a hidden fortress narrowly dismantled in time, but an absence that had existed from the beginning. The National Redoubt had never progressed beyond propaganda. There were no construction schedules, no logistics plans, no unified command designated to defend it. The SS units alleged to be concentrating in the Alps had either ceased to exist or were scattered remnants moving south in the hope of surrendering to Western forces. The traffic observed by reconnaissance aircraft was real, but its interpretation had been wrong. It was retreat, not preparation. German officers questioned after the war were consistent on one point. There had been no intention to fight on from the mountains. The regime had lost the capacity to coordinate such an effort by early 1945. Communications were fractured. Fuel was non-existent. Authority outside Berlin was theoretical. The idea of a prolonged Alpine resistance belonged to radio broadcasts, not operational planning. Joseph Goebbels' role became clear only later. The redoubt narrative had been designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. It reassured loyalists. It threatened enemies. Most effectively, it shifted Allied attention. The fact that it was believed was not evidence of its plausibility, but of its convenience. It aligned too neatly with Allied fears to be challenged aggressively. Eisenhower did not attempt to rewrite his reasoning in his memoirs. He acknowledged that Berlin had been attainable. He defended the halt on the grounds of alliance cohesion and casualty avoidance. He emphasized that his responsibility had been to conclude the war, not to claim symbols. The tone was measured. The justification remained institutional. Bradley's post-war reflections were quieter. He did not dispute the military logic of advancing east. He did not claim that the redoubt justified the halt. He focused instead on discipline. Orders had been issued. Orders had been followed. The system had worked as designed, even if the outcome was unsatisfying. Patton was less restrained. In private correspondence and later recollections, his frustration hardened into accusation. He described the Alpine campaign in terms of absurdity rather than relief. He noted the lack of resistance. He commented on the silence of the mountains. In one letter, he reduced the entire episode to a single conclusion. The Allies had been deceived, and they had cooperated in their own deception. Simpson rarely spoke publicly about the decision, but when he did, it was with distance rather than bitterness. He questioned whether confrontation at the Elbe might have been preferable to what followed. He did not claim certainty. He framed it as an unresolved calculation, one whose costs only became visible over time. Those costs did not appear immediately in casualty lists or occupation reports. They appeared in borders. The Elbe line, chosen as a temporary halt, hardened into a political fact. Occupation zones followed it with only minor adjustments. Administrative authority, police forces, and governments formed within the spaces that armies had occupied by default. What had not been contested could not be reclaimed without initiating a new war. The Soviet position in Berlin became unassailable not because it had been negotiated brilliantly, but because it had been uncontested militarily. Western leaders found themselves arguing over access corridors and air routes rather than authority. The city became divided not as a compromise, but as a correction. Declassified correspondence from the late 1940s revealed the shift in tone. The language of partnership disappeared quickly. Suspicion replaced it. Decisions made to preserve unity during the war were now cited as constraints in peace. No one referenced the redoubt anymore. It no longer mattered. The record did not condemn Eisenhower outright. It did not elevate Patton as a prophet. It documented a system responding rationally to false inputs and producing irreversible outcomes. The war had ended as planned. The settlement had not. When the files were finally complete, one conclusion was unavoidable. The last major territorial decision in Europe had not been decided by combat. It had been decided by belief. And belief, once institutionalized, proved harder to dismantle than any fortress that never existed. The case closes with a decision that achieved its immediate objective and reshaped the world that followed. The war in Europe ended on schedule. No Alpine campaign dragged into another year. No American armies bled in mountain passes. No second German resistance emerged from the south. On those terms, the decision held. But the cost was structural, not tactical. By halting at the Elbe, American forces accepted a boundary they did not contest and could not later revise. Berlin fell under exclusive Soviet control not because it was defended, but because it was conceded. Eastern and Central Europe followed the same pattern. Authority flowed to those who arrived first, not those who might have arrived fastest. The intelligence that drove the decision collapsed under post-war examination. The national redoubt was not dismantled. It was revealed to have never existed. What redirected entire armies was not enemy capability, but enemy narrative. The deception succeeded because it aligned with Allied fears and institutional caution. No individual actor emerges as reckless or incompetent. The system functioned precisely as it was designed to function. Intelligence was assessed. Risks were weighed. Alliances were preserved. Orders were obeyed. The outcome was orderly, controlled, and final. That orderliness masked the permanence of the result. What was avoided in April was not prolonged war, but immediate confrontation. What followed instead was 4 decades of division, enforced not by armies in motion, but by borders drawn where armies had stopped. The battlefield did not determine that outcome. The command room did. The decision to halt did not lose the war. It ended it. But it ended it on terms that transferred leverage eastward and locked it there without negotiation. History does not record this moment as a blunder shouted down or a gamble gone wrong. It records it as a rational choice made under false assumptions, whose consequences only became visible once reversal was no longer possible. The file is closed. The verdict is complete. If you want more investigations like this, decisions made far from the front, and the price paid afterward, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.